Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. I should have known better. There are times when silence isn't just peace. It's the warning before the storm. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong the moment I walked through the door. At first, I thought it was the house, its walls creaking with the weight of its age. But then, the air grew thicker. And I realized that wasn't all. It was an old house, small, tucked away in a forgotten part of town. The kind of house where every floorboard seemed to groan with secrets. I bought it on impulse, thinking a fresh start would somehow erase the weight of my past. But now, standing in the dim hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The first night was quiet. Too quiet. My own breathing echoed through the house, as though the very walls were holding their breath, waiting. There were no creaks of settling wood, no sound of passing cars from the street outside. Just silence. I didn't mind it at first. It was a relief from the chaos of the city. But as I sat there, staring into the shadows cast by the single dim light overhead, something felt off. At first, I tried to brush it off. A trick of the mind. A new place. A new start. But then I heard it, the faintest whisper, almost like a breath at my ear. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The silence seemed to press against my eardrums, suffocating me. It wasn't the wind. No, it was something far worse. The sound was coming from within the walls, from somewhere deep inside the house, curling around me, whispering my name. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. It's just the house settling. That's all it was. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that I was being watched. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady as I moved through the hallway. The house felt alive, the shadows reaching out at the edges of my vision, pulling me deeper into their grasp. Every step I took seemed to echo louder, until I could no longer tell where my footsteps ended and the whispers began. The staircase loomed in front of me. It was old, but worn smooth by years of use. But tonight, it looked wrong. The shadows clung to the edges, curling and twisting as though they had a mind of their own. My heart thudded in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to turn away. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking under my weight, the sound carrying down the narrow hallway above. It was quiet again, but the silence felt heavy, like it was waiting for something to break it. And then, just as I reached the top of the stairs, I heard it again. A faint shuffle, like something or someone was moving just out of sight. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. But the hallway was empty. Just a long, narrow stretch of floorboards stretching into the darkness. I took a cautious step forward, my pulse quickening, but there was nothing. Only the silence, thick and suffocating. Stop it, I told myself. It's just the house. But even as I thought that, I knew it wasn't. The air felt too dense, the shadows too deep. The house wasn't just old, it was hiding something. A presence. Something that was waiting for me to find it. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, creeping closer with every passing second. I turned quickly, heading for the nearest door, a bedroom that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The wood creaked under my feet as I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me. The room was small, the only furniture a bed covered in dust and old, yellowing sheets. But there was something else. Something I couldn't quite place. I stepped further in, the dust stirring in the dim light. That's when I noticed it, the smell. Faint at first, but growing stronger. A sickly, sweet odor that made my stomach turn. It was almost like something decaying. I moved to the window, pulling back the curtains, but the street outside was empty. The house felt closed off, like a tomb. Like it had swallowed the world outside and forgotten to let it back in. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. Not just any shadow, this one moved. It crawled along the floor, stretching toward me, long and dark, like a hand reaching out of the dark. I gasped and turned to face it, but the moment I did, it was gone. Just a fading trace in the air. My skin crawled. The silence was back again, only this time it felt heavier, more suffocating. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave. I needed to get out, but every step I took felt like it was leading me deeper into the house's grip. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows lengthening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. That it was watching me. The whispering started again, louder now, growing in intensity. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a presence, a living thing, wrapped around me like a coil, squeezing tighter with each breath I took. I wanted to run. I needed to run. But I couldn't. I couldn't escape it. The house had become a prison, and I was the one locked inside. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my body screaming to escape, but my legs felt like they were cemented to the floor. The shadows, they weren't just shadows anymore. They were something more, something alive. I could almost feel them breathing, as though they were waiting for me to make a move. The whispering, soft and insistent, filled the air, curling around my mind. I tried to block it out, to concentrate on anything other than that sound, but it was impossible. It wasn't coming from just one place anymore, it was everywhere, slipping through the cracks in the walls, oozing from the corners of the room, as though the house itself was speaking to me, telling me that there was no escape. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to shut it out, but it didn't help. It only grew louder, more urgent, more frantic. The sound shifted, morphing from whispers into something more coherent. It wasn't just a voice, it was voices layered on top of each other, all calling my name. John. The voice was low, a raspy, guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. But it wasn't just one voice, it was many, all overlapping, all echoing through the room like an endless cacophony of tormented souls. My breath hitched in my chest. John, help us. I gasped, stumbling backward, knocking over a chair in the process. The room tilted, the walls seemingly closing in, pressing down on me. The temperature dropped suddenly, a coldness that seeped into my bones. I could feel it, the presence, the weight of something unseen yet so real that it consumed everything. I spun around, searching for something, anything to anchor me to reality. The bed. The dust-covered sheets. The window, still closed, no escape. The shadows stretched out from every corner, like claws reaching for me, inching closer with every passing second. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was listen to the voices, listen as they surrounded me, their tone now desperate. You shouldn't have come back. I didn't know who or what was speaking, but the words hit me with a force I couldn't explain. A cold sweat broke out across my skin, and I could feel my pulse in my throat, pounding wildly. Something was wrong with this house. Something was wrong with me for even being here. I had to get out. I had to get away from the voices. They were getting closer, the sound of feet shuffling behind me. No, not behind me. Inside me. Suddenly, I snapped. The door. I had to open it. I turned and ran toward it, my hands shaking as I grabbed the knob. But it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself had locked me in. John. That voice again, clearer now. Right behind me. I spun around, and my eyes locked onto the shadow in the corner of the room. It was moving, a figure emerging from the darkness, tall and distorted. Its features were obscured by the thick shadows that clung to it, but I could see its eyes, black, hollow, staring directly at me. I stumbled backward, my breath ragged, my body trembling. I could feel the tears starting to sting the back of my eyes, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't look away. The figure stepped closer, its footsteps eerily silent on the old wooden floor. It moved like it was part of the shadows themselves, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, bending in ways they shouldn't have. And then, the whispering stopped. All at once. It was replaced by something far worse. A slow, hollow breathing rising from the depths of the thing's chest. In the stillness, I could hear its every movement, its slow, deliberate steps, the sound of something dragging behind it. It didn't make a sound when it reached me, but I could feel its presence like an iron weight on my chest. For a moment, there was nothing but the breath. And then, in a voice that was far too loud, too clear, it spoke. You can't escape. The words echoed in my ears, reverberating through my skull. My mind raced, but nothing made sense. It was here, right in front of me, and I had nowhere to run. The shadow lifted its hand, long fingers, twisted and unnaturally thin, reaching for me. I didn't think. I couldn't. I just reacted. I shoved it away. The room seemed to shudder, the walls groaning as if the house itself were protesting. I stumbled back, desperate for air, desperate to find anything to break free of its grasp. The door, the window, anything. But there was nothing. You shouldn't have come back, the voice whispered again, softer now. And then, with a final, rattling breath, the figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as if it had never been there. The room fell silent again, the air thick and suffocating. I could still hear it. The whispering. The voices. But now, it wasn't just in the walls. It was inside my head. Inside me. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was trapped. In the silence, I knew one thing for certain: the house had claimed me. I was no longer a visitor here. I was part of its history now. The walls knew my name, and they would never let me leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, watching me. It wasn't just the whispers now. It was the silence that was the most unsettling. The walls seemed to press in around me, tightening with every passing minute. I couldn't focus. My mind raced, fragmented thoughts colliding with one another. Was I going mad? Was I imagining this? But deep down, I knew I wasn't. It was real. It had to be. The shadows. The voice. The thing in the corner. I stumbled over to the bed, feeling the weight of the house on my shoulders as if it were a living, breathing entity pressing down on me. The sheets felt wrong, cold, unnatural. I couldn't bear to sit on them. Every part of me screamed to leave, but I didn't know where to go. The door wouldn't open. The windows were locked tight. I felt trapped, like an animal in a cage. I looked around, desperately searching for anything to make sense of what was happening. The small, dusty lamp on the nightstand caught my eye. I turned it on, the dim light flickering weakly. For a moment, it seemed like everything was okay, like I had imagined the entire thing. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. A shadow that didn't belong. It was in the corner again. A shape, darker than the rest of the room, moving just slightly, enough to make me pause. I held my breath, afraid that if I made a sound, it would notice me. The air in the room grew heavier, thick with tension. I couldn't see it clearly, just that there was something there, something waiting. Watching. I got up, slowly, my legs trembling beneath me. Every step I took seemed to echo in the silence. The air was so still. Too still. The shadow in the corner shifted, and that was all it took for the panic to rise in my throat. My hands were shaking now, cold sweat beating at my forehead. I forced myself to move toward it, knowing I needed to face whatever it was. I couldn't just hide forever. But as I approached, I felt the temperature drop, the room getting colder with each step. The shadow grew larger, stretching unnaturally, as if it were reaching for me. I swallowed hard. I was almost there, just a few more steps. My heart pounded in my chest. Please, just let me get close enough to see it, to understand what's happening. I reached out. Just a little further. Bang! The door slammed shut behind me, the sound loud enough to rattle the windows. I spun around, adrenaline flooding my veins. My breath came in ragged gasps, my eyes darting between the door and the shadow. The air around me felt like it was charged with static, crackling with something I couldn't explain. The room was closing in again, the walls pressing inward, squeezing the air out of my lungs. I didn't have much time. I ran toward the door, yanking at the handle with all my strength. It was locked. It was always locked. My fingers slipped, a cold sweat making it harder to get a good grip. I could hear it now, the slow shuffle of something behind me. The sound of feet dragging, moving closer with each passing second. No, no, no! I had to get out. The shadow was growing behind me, and as I turned back toward it, I could see it more clearly now. It wasn't just a shadow, it was formless, twisting and writhing, like something trying to emerge from the walls themselves. The darkness consumed it. I could see long fingers now, stretching out from the massive shadow, claws scraping against the floor. It was coming for me. I couldn't think. I just had to act. I turned back to the door and slammed my shoulder into it, desperation giving me the strength I needed. The door rattled, but it didn't open. Another crash, another impact, but still nothing. The voice came again. This time, it was a laugh, low, rumbling, and full of malice. You can't escape. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was inside me, inside my mind, crawling around like an insect, whispering lies. I wasn't sure what was real anymore. What had been real? What had happened in the past few minutes was a blur, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I threw myself at the window, using my fists to pound at the glass, my knuckles splitting open with each hit. The pain barely registered. The glass wouldn't break. It wouldn't break. The shadow was getting closer now, and I could feel its cold presence creeping up behind me. It wasn't just in my head anymore, it was real. Whatever it was here. I had to keep moving. I had to find a way out. But where? How? There was no escape. The house had already claimed me. It had pulled me in, and now it was going to keep me. It would never let me go. I turned around to face the thing, to meet whatever was coming for me. The laughter was louder now, surrounding me, drowning me. And then, just as I thought it was the end, the ground beneath me gave way. I fell. The darkness swallowed me whole. I woke with a jolt, my body jerking upright, only to find myself in complete darkness. My chest was tight, my breath shallow, and my heart hammered in my ears like a drum. For a moment, I thought I had dreamed it all, the shadows, the voices, the cold touch of the thing behind me. But the crushing weight in my chest told me otherwise. This was real. I hadn't escaped. The air around me was thick, damp with the smell of decay. My hands reached out, trembling, scraping against the rough, cold stone beneath me. I was lying on the ground, no bed, no furniture, just cold, unforgiving stone. It was as if the world had swallowed me whole. I tried to stand, but my legs were unsteady. They felt weak, as though the fall had taken everything out of me. I staggered to my feet, my head spinning, and tried to gather my bearings. Where was I? How far had I fallen? The last thing I remembered was the ground opening up beneath me. I could still feel the weight of it, like an invisible hand pulling me into the abyss. I reached out again, my fingers brushing against something that felt like a wall, slick and cold. My hand slid down, and I could feel the unevenness of the surface beneath my touch. This wasn't a room. It wasn't a hallway. I was trapped in some kind of cave. I shuddered, my mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. My breath hitched as I recalled the feeling of falling, the sensation of the ground vanishing beneath me. I had been sucked into this place, this darkness. I took a step forward, each movement slow, tentative, as if the very air around me was conspiring to keep me from moving too quickly. The silence was suffocating, pressing on me, and I could barely hear my own breathing. It was like the sound itself was being swallowed by the walls. I couldn't even hear my footsteps. It was unnatural. I took another step, this time feeling the stone beneath my feet crack and shift, as though it was unstable, ready to collapse at any moment. The walls were too close. I could feel them on either side, constricting around me, the tunnel narrowing with every step. I tried to keep my balance, but the air felt off, like it was pressing down on me, pushing me into the ground. I couldn't breathe. And then I heard it. A soft, wet sound, like something dragging along the floor behind me. I froze. My heart stopped. It wasn't my footsteps. I was certain of that. It was a dragging sound, slow, deliberate. And it was getting closer. My body tensed, every muscle screaming for me to move, to run, but I couldn't. My feet were cemented to the ground. The sound stopped. I didn't breathe. I didn't dare move a muscle. Then, a low, guttural voice broke the silence. You shouldn't have come here. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a shout. It was a low growl, vibrating through the walls like it was coming from inside my very bones. I gasped, a jagged breath catching in my throat. The voice was cold, cruel, and familiar. I turned, my body moving on instinct, my eyes desperately searching for the source of the voice. But the darkness was absolute. I couldn't see a thing. Just black. Nothing. Who's there? I croaked, my voice trembling as I called out into the empty space. Show yourself. No answer. Only the deafening silence that seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. But then, I saw it. A pair of eyes, gleaming faintly in the pitch black. They were almost too bright, like they didn't belong in this place. They hovered in the darkness, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The eyes locked onto mine, and I felt the weight of them pressing into my mind, digging into my thoughts, pulling at my very soul. The voice came again, softer this time, but still filled with that same deep malice. You can't leave. You're already part of it. The last word echoed in the silence, and a chill ran down my spine. The eyes flickered, just for a moment, and then the darkness seemed to shift. The ground beneath me felt unstable again, like I was standing at the edge of a cliff. My legs buckled, and I fell to the ground, my hand bracing for impact. But when I touched the stone, it didn't feel solid. It was like my hand sank into it, the surface soft, pliable, as if the rock were alive. I screamed, yanking my hand back. What was happening? What was this place? Suddenly, the walls around me began to move, shifting, groaning, bending inward. The air grew heavier, thicker. The very stone was warping, alive in some way I couldn't understand. The eyes blinked once more, and then they were gone. I had to get out. I pushed myself to my feet, my heart racing as I staggered backward. But I didn't know where to go. There was nowhere to run. The walls were closing in. The tunnel was narrowing. Then I heard something far worse than the dragging noise. A low screeching, a scraping, like nails against stone. It was getting closer. It was coming for me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I had to get out. But no matter how fast I ran, the walls kept closing in. And the eyes, they were always there, watching. Always. My breath was ragged, my chest heaving as I stumbled through the collapsing tunnel, each step desperate, frantic. The screeching noise behind me was growing louder, closer, closer still. It was like the walls themselves were alive, shifting and writhing, pushing me into a corner I couldn't escape from. I glanced behind me, and the eyes, those unnaturally bright, malevolent eyes, were there, flickering in the dark, following my every move. I couldn't see what they belonged to, but I knew it wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could understand. My heart slammed against my ribs, and my mind screamed for me to run faster. The walls shifted again, closing in tighter. There was no escape. The ground beneath me felt unstable, soft as though the stone was giving way, like it was going to swallow me whole. I reached out, feeling along the surface for anything that could hold me up, but my fingers slipped off the wet, clammy stone. Please, I whispered, breathless, my voice shaking as I cried out into the void. Please, I need to get out. My voice seemed to vanish as soon as it left my mouth, swallowed up by the darkness. No response. Only the screeching, the scratching, growing louder as though something was crawling just out of sight, its claws scraping against the walls, reaching for me. A cold wave of panic washed over me. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going. My legs were shaking beneath me, and my mind was unraveling. Every footstep felt like it could be my last. I had to get out. There had to be an exit, some way out. I sprinted forward, blindly, every step a prayer, every turn a gamble. The tunnel twisted and turned, every corner leading to more darkness, more uncertainty. I thought I saw a faint glimmer of light up ahead, a crack, a break in the oppressive blackness, but I couldn't be sure. It was impossible to tell what was real anymore. My feet slipped on the uneven ground, and I lost my balance, crashing to the stone with a sharp gasp. My palms scraped against the cold surface as I tried to push myself up, but my body felt numb. The air was thick, suffocating. It felt as though the very space around me was pressing down on me, dragging me into the ground. I had to stand. I had to keep going. But then, a sound, a voice, this time louder, sharper, cut through the silence. It wasn't the growl or the scratching. No, this was different. It was laughter. Cold. Empty. Unfeeling. The sound echoed around me, reverberating through the walls, and my stomach churned. I whipped my head around, trying to see through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The laughter persisted, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone. I pushed myself to my feet, my mind screaming in terror, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't stay. The laughter, it was closing in on me, surrounding me. It felt like it was inside my head, inside my very soul. Stop. Leave me alone. I shouted, my voice cracking, but the laughter only grew louder, more maddening. The walls were pressing in tighter. My breath quickened, and I felt my chest constricting. The air was thinner now, harder to breathe. I could hear the faintest sound of dragging again, like something was moving just behind me. I couldn't turn around. I couldn't face it. Then, I saw it again. A flicker of light. This time, it was clearer. A break in the endless blackness. A door. A way out. I didn't think. I just ran. The laughter was deafening now, and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. Something was right there. I could feel it, its presence, like it was touching me. But I didn't dare look back. I reached the light. No, it wasn't a door, it was just a crack in the stone. A narrow gap. I pushed myself through it, squeezing through the tight opening, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of the laughter stopped. The scratching stopped. The tunnel went silent. For a moment, I could only hear my ragged breathing. I stumbled out into the open, gasping for air, collapsing onto the ground. My hands were covered in dirt, my clothes torn, my body shaking violently from exhaustion and fear. I didn't know where I was. The air was different here, fresher, colder. But I didn't care. I was out. I was free. At least, I thought I was. I looked up. The stars. I was outside. I had escaped the tunnel. But then, I saw it. The same set of eyes, gleaming in the distance. And they were staring right at me. It started with a feeling, a strange, unsettling sensation that clung to me as I walked past the old building. I had seen it countless times before, standing there on the edge of the town, an ancient, crumbling structure with iron walls that seemed to be slowly devouring themselves. But today, something felt different. The air was heavier, thick with a sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake off. I couldn't explain it, but something about the building was calling me, as if the very walls themselves were whispering secrets, telling stories of things that happened long ago. Forgotten victims. Tragedies. I could almost hear their voices if I listened closely enough. The town around me was quiet. It was late, and the streets were nearly empty. But the building, those iron walls, they seemed to hum with a strange energy, as if they were alive. I paused for a moment, my footsteps faltering as I glanced up at the rusted structure. There were no windows, just iron, thick and black, like the face of something that had seen too much. I shouldn't have gone closer. I knew that even before I made the decision to approach, but I did anyway. There was something irresistible about the place, something I couldn't explain, something I was drawn to, as though the iron walls themselves were pulling me in. As I neared the entrance, a low groan echoed from within, a sound like metal scraping against metal, reverberating through the empty streets. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The noise was subtle, but there was no mistaking it. It was coming from the building. And it wasn't the wind. I turned my head, scanning the quiet street behind me. The town was still. No one in sight. But the groan persisted, louder now, followed by a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. My skin prickled, and a shiver ran down my spine. I took a hesitant step forward. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to invite me in. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, my fingers brushing the cold, rough metal. For a moment, I hesitated. Something deep within me screamed to turn around, to leave this place and never return. But curiosity won out. I pushed the door open. The darkness inside was thick, almost tangible. The air was damp, the smell of rust and decay heavy in my lungs. The walls, made of dark iron, stretched high above me, their surface edged with strange symbols and markings. I could just make out the faint outlines of old murals, faded and cracked with age. I took a slow step forward, the floor creaking beneath me, as if it, too, was protesting my presence. The whispers grew louder, more distinct now. I couldn't understand the words, but they were there, like a distant murmur, speaking to me from every corner of the room. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming. Something was in this place. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, its presence, lurking just beyond the reach of my senses. The air seemed to grow colder with each step, the shadows deepening. Then, I heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the hall. They weren't mine. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. No one. Just the empty room, the rusted walls, the heavy silence. But then, the whispering returned. A voice, clear now, a woman's voice, soft and mournful. Help me. My heart raced as I stumbled backward, my pulse pounding in my ears. I couldn't think straight. The voice, it wasn't real. It couldn't be. I turned toward the exit, but it was gone. The door was no longer ajar. The space that had once been open was now closed off, leaving me trapped in the dark with the whispering walls. And then, in the silence, a shadow moved across the floor, creeping toward me. The shadow moved slowly, almost deliberately, its edges flickering as if it were uncertain of its own existence. My breath caught in my throat, every instinct screaming at me to run, to escape the suffocating darkness that closed in around me. I turned, trying to find the door, the exit, anything to get away, but the space had shifted. The walls seemed to loom closer, their oppressive presence weighing heavily on my chest. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The whispering voice was gone now, replaced by a low, almost rhythmic sound, a tapping like fingernails drumming against wood. But there was no wood here. Just iron. Solid, unyielding iron. I tried to move, but my feet felt glued to the floor, as though the building itself had claimed me, rooting me to this place. The shadows grew longer, stretching across the floor toward me, twisting like dark fingers reaching out to drag me into the abyss. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, scrambling for a rational explanation. This couldn't be real. I had to be imagining it. There had to be some logical explanation for the noises, for the shadows, for the oppressive weight in the air. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. The shadows stopped moving. A chill ran through me, sharp and cold, like ice creeping into my bones. I dared not turn around. I didn't want to see what was behind me, didn't want to face whatever it was that lingered just out of sight. The air was thick with an unsettling silence, broken only by the soft, incessant tapping, now closer than before. I closed my eyes, willing myself to wake up, to open them and find myself standing outside, away from the iron walls, away from this nightmare. But when I opened them again, the darkness remained unyielding, suffocating. And then it spoke. A voice. But not like the one I had heard before. This one was deeper, guttural, distorted, as if it was trying to speak through layers of time, through layers of death. Leave, before it's too late. The words sent a shock of terror through me, and in an instant, I could feel my pulse thundering in my ears. My heart raced, my hands trembling as I tried to take a step back, to retreat into the faintest sliver of light. But there was no escape. The room had swallowed the light, had consumed it, leaving me in a cavern of blackness, with only the whispering iron walls to keep me company. The tapping stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but the oppressive silence, as if the building itself had fallen into a deep, unbroken slumber. But I knew better. The air felt charged, alive with something ancient, something malevolent that had taken root in these walls long ago. I took a shaky breath, my eyes darting around in desperation. The shadow, that dark, writhing thing, was no longer where it had been. It had vanished, leaving only the lingering sensation of its presence. I thought I could feel it, its cold gaze, watching me from the darkness. But there was nothing there. Just the stillness, the unnatural quiet that seemed to swallow every sound, every thought. Then, as if mocking me, the tapping began again. Louder. Faster. Almost frantic. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned toward the walls, my eyes scanning every inch, every crack, every crevice. There had to be a way out. There had to be. The tapping was growing more erratic now, and I could feel my mind starting to fray at the edges. I had to move. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold, rusted surface of the iron wall. It was solid, unyielding. My heart hammered in my chest as I pressed harder, hoping for some crack, some opening, anything. But nothing. And then I heard it. A sound like nails scraping against the wall, sharp and piercing. It echoed through the room, reverberating in my skull. I turned, and there it was, right in front of me. A face. A twisted, grotesque face, barely human, its features contorted in agony. It was so close, so impossibly close, and yet it was nothing more than a dark shape. The eyes, if you could call them that, were wide, hollow pits, black as coal. The mouth was open, twisted in a scream that could not be heard, a scream that had been lost to time. I couldn't move. And then it reached for me. The moment the shadowy figure reached out, I stumbled backward, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. My body refused to move fast enough, as if the iron walls themselves were pulling me closer to that horrible, gaping maw. I felt a coldness envelop me. No, not just cold, but a deep, suffocating chill, like the very air had turned to ice. My vision blurred for a moment, my legs unsteady beneath me. I tried to scream, but my throat closed. No sound came. The face hovered closer, so close now that I could see the fine details, the twisted skin stretched over bone, the jagged teeth that seemed to move, shifting with an unnatural rhythm. Its eyes, those empty sockets, seemed to pull at my very soul, drawing me into their void. I couldn't breathe. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape, but the room had shifted again, its dimensions distorting, closing in tighter around me. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsating in time with the thudding of my heart. The figure reached out, its hand cold and skeletal, its fingers elongated and grasping. I felt the icy touch of its fingers brushing my arm, sending a shock of freezing terror through my entire body. "Leave, now!" The voice again, guttural, distorted, as though it was emerging from the depths of the earth itself. The words clawed at my mind, pulling me deeper into a void of confusion and dread. I could feel the weight of its presence, pressing in on me from all sides. The room itself seemed to warp, to twist in unnatural ways, like the very walls were alive, breathing with some ancient, malevolent energy. I blinked, desperately trying to focus, trying to tear my mind away from the nightmare that was consuming me. And then I saw it. In the corner of my eye, hidden in the darkness, I saw a glimmer, a faint glimmer of something metallic. A shape. A reflection. My mind seized on it, a lifeline, a potential escape. I turned toward it, not even thinking about the danger, driven by the desperate need to get away from the grasping figure. The glimmering object was a key. A rusted, tarnished key, half buried in the corner, the shape of it just visible in the dim light. It seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as though it were calling to me. The thought of escaping, of unlocking whatever door might exist within this cursed place, overwhelmed my fear. I lunged toward it, my fingers scraping against the cold, jagged floor, reaching for the key. But the moment my hand made contact with it, the entire room seemed to lurch. The walls trembled, the air thick with a low, rumbling growl. The figure, no longer a shadow, but a grotesque, half-formed creature of flesh and bone, screeched, its face contorting in a twisted snarl as it pulled back its hand. I yanked the key free, my hand shaking violently, the coldness of the metal seeping into my skin. For a moment, there was silence. The tapping stopped, the shadows stilled. The creature halted, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. The key, its rusted surface, felt strangely warm in my hand now, as if it had come to life with my touch. I turned it over, searching for any sign of where it might fit. The creature's mouth opened wider, its lips curling back to reveal rows of jagged teeth, all broken and uneven. Its voice came again, no longer a whisper but a low, rasping growl. "You shouldn't have touched it," it hissed. "It's too late." I didn't care. I couldn't care. The need to escape, to break free from whatever hell I had walked into, overwhelmed me. I turned, searching frantically for a lock, a door, anything. The walls were still closing in. The room was shifting again. I ran. My feet pounded against the floor, echoing through the twisted space, but every step seemed to take me farther from the door, farther from freedom. The wall stretched, then shrank, as though the entire building was mocking me, toying with my fear. The tapping started again, faster, louder. closer. I couldn't see the figure anymore, but I could feel it, its presence, its breath on my neck. I reached out in desperation, trying to find something to hold on to, something to stop the shifting nightmare. My fingers brushed against the cold, iron surface of a wall, and then I felt it. A door. The rusted, ancient door was there, hidden in the far corner, behind the shifting shadows. I jammed the key into the lock, praying it would work. The key turned with an agonizing slowness, its groan like the sound of 1,000 tortured souls. And then, finally, the door creaked open. But as I stepped through, I knew it wasn't over. Something was following me. Something had changed. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash, the noise echoing in the vast emptiness of the space I had entered. I spun around, heart racing, expecting to see the creature's grotesque face peering through the gap, its hollow eyes searing through the darkness. But the hallway before me was quiet. Unnaturally so. The air in this new space was thick with dust, the oppressive silence settling like a weight on my chest. The walls here were different, smooth, cold stone, without the twisting metal I had just escaped. But despite the change in the surroundings, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still trapped in that suffocating nightmare. The key in my hand felt heavier, almost burning with a strange heat. I stumbled forward, my footsteps slow, cautious. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my mind screamed at me to run, to keep moving, to escape, but my legs felt as though they were made of stone, unwilling to obey. I passed through what looked like a long, narrow corridor, its walls lined with paintings that had long since faded to nothing more than indistinct smears of color. The air here was stagnant, and the faint, musty scent of decay lingered, mingling with something else, something sharp, like the scent of rust or old blood. I reached out, my fingers brushing lightly against one of the paintings. The surface was cold to the touch, the frame brittle with age. My mind was still reeling from the encounter with that creature, but something about the artwork compelled me to look closer. I squinted, trying to make out the details, but the painting was no longer just a blur of colors. It was moving. The faces in the painting were shifting, twisting slowly, as if the figures trapped in the frame were struggling to escape. Their eyes, hollow and lost, seemed to follow me, and I felt a shiver of dread crawl up my spine. The longer I stared at the scene, the more I could hear soft whispers, barely audible, like murmurs in the wind. I pulled my hand away, my skin crawling. The whispers grew louder, now a chorus of voices, rising in intensity. They were coming from all directions, but no one was there. The walls themselves seemed to be breathing, alive with a pulse that matched the thudding of my heart. The sounds were impossible to ignore, pressing in on me, suffocating me. I had to keep moving. The hallway stretched before me, longer than it should have been, twisting unnaturally. Each step I took seemed to stretch the distance further, and with every passing second, I felt more and more disoriented. The key in my hand seemed to grow colder, and the air became denser, pressing against me, making it harder to breathe. Then, there it was, a door. A solid, wooden door at the far end of the hallway, slightly ajar. The faintest sliver of light slipped through the crack, illuminating the floor. Hope surged within me. Maybe there was an exit, a way out of this madness. I couldn't afford to waste any more time. I stumbled toward the door, my hand reaching out. But the moment I touched the handle, a noise echoed behind me, a scraping sound, like nails against stone. I froze. Slowly, I turned. The hallway behind me was dark, the whispers still swirling in the air, but there was no sign of movement, nothing that could explain the noise. My pulse quickened as the scraping sound came again, louder this time, and closer. It was as if something was dragging itself across the floor, inch by inch, getting closer with every heartbeat. I gripped the door handle tighter, but it refused to budge. It was locked. The scraping sound grew louder, now a relentless, bone-chilling noise. I could almost feel the cold breath of whatever was out there, creeping up behind me. My mind screamed for me to turn, to look, to run, but my body refused to obey. The very air around me seemed to freeze in place, trapping me in a moment of pure terror. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the door behind me swung open, the light spilling into the hallway, spilling into my trembling hands. I bolted through it, feeling the cold tendrils of fear scraping at my back. The air shifted again, the sound of dragging feet now replaced with a heavy, rhythmic thudding, closer and closer. I didn't stop to look. I couldn't. The space I entered was different, a large, open room. The walls were lined with strange symbols, etched deep into the stone, glowing faintly in the dark. I had no idea what they meant, but the sight of them only filled me with more dread. The room was vast, stretching out in all directions. In the center was a large, round table, covered in dust, with a single chair pushed up to it. The door slammed shut behind me, and I whirled around in panic. The sound of dragging feet had stopped. The silence was deafening. But something in the air had shifted. There was a weight, a presence that hadn't been there before. I was no longer alone. The chair at the table creaked as though someone had just sat down in it. I couldn't see who it was. I didn't need to. I could feel them, just beyond my sight. The whispering started again. "Welcome," the voice rasped, low and distorted, as if it were coming from every direction. "You shouldn't have come." The lights flickered, and for the briefest moment, I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, cloaked in shadows. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air felt heavier, pressing in on me from all sides. And then, in an instant, the figure lunged. The walls themselves seemed to close in as I tried to scramble away. I could hear the scratching, the hissing breath of whatever was pursuing me. And then, darkness. The darkness swallowed me whole. I could feel the weight of it, heavy and suffocating, pressing against my chest. My limbs were leaden, unresponsive as I struggled to find any semblance of control. There was no air, no sound, only an overwhelming, all-consuming quiet that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I could feel it, the presence that had been stalking me, drawing closer. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its proximity, its malevolent gaze boring into me like a hot needle through flesh. It wasn't just watching. It was waiting for something. Waiting for me to make a mistake, to falter. I gasped, desperate for air, my heart hammering against my ribs. I needed to get out. I needed to leave this cursed place before whatever it was caught me. I had to move, had to find a way to escape, but my legs felt like they were trapped in quicksand, pulling me deeper into the abyss. Suddenly, there was a shift. The silence cracked. A low sound, almost like a growl, slithered through the dark, rattling my bones. I tried to turn, to look for any sign of escape, but the darkness enveloped me so completely that I couldn't even tell which way was up. The growl grew louder, vibrating through the floor, through my very skin. I felt something cold, wet, brushing against my face, and a rush of terror shot through me. It was as if the shadows themselves had taken form, wrapping around me, pressing in from all sides. I stumbled forward, desperate for any sign of light, any hint of safety. But the walls, those damn iron walls, kept closing in. I could hear the soft scraping of metal against stone, the sound growing louder, sharper, closer. It's here. The thought pierced my mind like a dagger, and I froze. I could hear its breathing now, shallow and uneven, like the rasp of a dying animal. The air felt thick with the scent of blood, dank, metallic, choking. My heart pounded in my throat, and I fought to keep my breath steady to avoid drawing its attention. The scrape of metal turned into something more tangible, something real. It wasn't just in the shadows anymore. It was in the room, moving with a terrible purpose. I heard it before I saw it. A soft whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable in its malice. You cannot escape. The voice was raspy, as if it had been pulled from the depths of a nightmare. It was so close now that I could feel its presence in my bones. It wasn't just a voice. It was an accusation, a warning. I whipped around, my eyes searching through the inky blackness, but saw nothing. Only the endless stretch of shadow that seemed to reach and claw at the edges of my sanity. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, shifting in the darkness, barely visible, its face hidden in the shadows, but its eyes glowing faintly, two slivers of light piercing through the black. They were watching me. I could feel them, like hot embers. There was no face, no human features. Just a shifting mass of darkness, its outline barely visible against the walls. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, suffocated by the air around me. It moved closer. I stumbled back, my hands searching for something to hold onto, something solid. But everything was slippery, shifting, like I was trapped in a nightmare where nothing was real. The walls pressed in tighter, the air becoming thick and stifling. No escape. The whisper came again, but this time it was clearer. It was right next to me, close enough that I could feel the breath, cold, rancid, and foul, rushing over my skin. I spun around, heart racing, but all I saw were the shadows closing in on me. It was right behind me. I could feel its presence, the suffocating weight of it. It was like being trapped in a room with a predator, unable to escape, unable to breathe. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but I couldn't see anything. There was no door, no window, no escape. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, trying to control the panic that was rising in my chest. I had to think, had to find a way out. My mind was racing, my body trembling in fear. But then, through the haze of terror, I remembered something, the key. I fumbled in my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold, smooth metal. The key was still there, still in my possession. My only hope. But I didn't know what it unlocked. I didn't know if it would even help me escape. I turned, my hands shaking as I tried to find the door, the way out. I didn't care what it opened, as long as it was a way out of this nightmare. The shadows shifted again, and I felt its presence moving closer, the weight of it pressing down on me, suffocating me. I couldn't wait. I had to act now. With trembling hands, I shoved the key into the first door I found, a small, nondescript wooden door that had somehow appeared before me in the dark. I twisted the key, praying it would work, praying it would be the escape I needed. The door creaked open, and for a moment, I thought I had finally escaped. But as I stepped forward, something yanked me back. A cold hand, icy, like death itself, wrapped around my wrist. No one leaves. The voice was louder this time, and I turned to face it, my heart thundering in my chest. But there was nothing there. Just the darkness. And then, in a flash, everything went black. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you? Not just the typical feeling of eyes on your back, but a deep, gut-wrenching sense that something is there, unseen, always waiting? That's how I felt, walking through the streets that night, the cold air biting at my skin. It was the kind of cold that gets into your bones, but there was something else, too, a weight in the air, a heaviness that didn't belong. It wasn't the first time I had this feeling, but this time it was different. More intense. I couldn't shake it. The shadows of the city felt longer, darker, and the silence deeper than usual. Every step I took seemed to echo too loudly in the empty streets. My breath came out in foggy bursts, mixing with the mist rising from the cobblestone. The lamps flickered above me, casting weak pools of light that only deepened the darkness between them. My name is Thomas, and this isn't my first encounter with fear. But something was wrong tonight. I could feel it, like an invisible force tugging at the edges of my awareness, nudging me toward paranoia. It was always a little bit of a joke between my friends. They'd say, "Thomas, always on edge, like something's lurking in the corner," and I'd laugh it off, pretending it was nothing more than nerves. But tonight, I wasn't laughing. I had been walking for hours, aimlessly, trying to clear my mind of the events that had happened earlier in the day, things that still left a bitter taste in my mouth. I had been visiting the old mansion again. The mansion that had been abandoned for years, with its peeling walls and shattered windows, but which seemed to draw me back, time and time again. I stopped on the corner of the street, glancing back at the looming building. The mansion was still there, unchanged, silent in its brooding isolation. But it wasn't the mansion that disturbed me. It was what had happened inside. The feeling of being watched, not just by the walls of the house, but by something beyond it. Something alive, or at least, something that had once been alive. I had been inside the mansion earlier that day, poking around as I always did. The air was thick with dust, and the creaking floors groaned underfoot as I explored room after room. The house had an odd energy to it, an unnatural silence that didn't belong in a space so decayed. But it wasn't the silence that unsettled me most. It was the shadows, the way they seemed to move with me, always just out of the corner of my eye. I would turn, expecting to catch the tail end of some errant beam of light, only to find nothing. Until I reached the library. The library was different from the rest of the house. It was dark, yes, but there was something more. Something in the air that made my skin prickle with unease. A presence. The shelves were lined with old, forgotten books, their pages yellowed with age. But as I ran my hand across one of them, I felt it. The faintest tug, like a whisper brushing against my ear. I couldn't explain it, but in that moment, I knew I wasn't alone. It was then that I heard the first sound. A soft creak, like someone, or something, stepping lightly across the floor behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned, my pulse racing. But there was nothing there. The room was empty, the dust undisturbed. And yet, the sensation of being watched only grew stronger. That was when I saw it. In the far corner of the room, where the shadows grew deepest, something moved. A shape, barely perceptible at first, but unmistakable. It was not human, but it had a presence. A looming figure, tall and dark, barely formed but somehow solid in the darkness. I froze. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. I ran. I didn't care about the rest of the house. I didn't care about the mysteries I had been searching for. I just needed to get out. The door slammed behind me, and I found myself back on the street, my hands shaking, my head spinning. The feeling of being watched never left me. And now, as I stood on that corner, staring back at the mansion, I knew it wasn't over. That presence, whatever it was, hadn't left. It was still there, lurking, waiting for the next moment to strike. I could feel it now, like an icy hand resting on the back of my neck. The feeling of being watched, of being followed. I wasn't alone. I never had been. And as I turned down the street, I couldn't shake the thought that I was being led somewhere, pulled by some unseen force. But where? And why? The night stretched before me, full of unknowns. Every step I took seemed to echo louder, as if the shadows were inching closer with every move I made. And I knew, deep down, that I was already too far gone to turn back. The feeling didn't leave. It pressed on me, like a constant weight against my chest, a suffocating reminder that I was not alone. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic beat of my own footsteps. Yet, the silence only made the feeling worse, heightening every rustle in the distance, every shift of air, as if something was hiding in the shadows, following my every move. I couldn't shake the image of the dark figure from the library, the shape in the corner, its form flickering and shifting like smoke. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that it was just the tricks of light, shadows playing tricks on my tired eyes. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't my mind playing games with me. Something was there. Something was watching. I kept walking, but it felt like the world around me was closing in. The buildings seemed to loom taller, their windows reflecting the pale moonlight like hollow eyes staring down at me. Every street lamp flickered in unison, casting weak, trembling light, as if afraid of what lay just beyond its reach. The temperature had dropped, the cold seeping into my bones, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. Nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat. The feeling of being watched intensified, crawling under my skin, swirling around me like an invisible fog. It wasn't just an abstract sensation anymore, it was real. A presence. It was as though I was no longer just walking through the streets, but walking through a maze built by something otherworldly. My every move was being scrutinized. My every thought was being heard. The weight of it pressed down on me, and I couldn't tell if I was losing my mind or if it was the world itself that was slowly warping around me. I turned a corner, my pace quickening. I didn't know where I was going anymore, just that I couldn't stay still. The street ahead was darker, the buildings around me older, their stone facades crumbling with age. This area wasn't a place I usually walked, and a quick glance at the unfamiliar surroundings sent a jolt of unease through me. The air smelled damp, a musky scent that mingled with something faintly metallic, like blood. The street was narrow, lined with tall, imposing buildings whose windows were dark, empty. It felt wrong. I stopped, suddenly aware of the stillness. The sounds of the city seemed to vanish, as though this place existed in a pocket outside of time. A shadow moved, just a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. My heart raced. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head to look. Nothing. Just the usual darkened alleyway stretching before me, the faint light of the street lamp casting long shadows along the cracked pavement. But I could feel it. I could sense it. And then I heard it. A whisper. Soft. Barely audible. I turned, heart pounding. A cold draft brushed against my face. My eyes scanned the shadows, desperately trying to find the source of the sound, but there was nothing. It was as though the whisper had come from nowhere, seeping into my ears without a trace. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and I realized with sudden clarity I wasn't just being watched. I was being listened to. Every breath, every movement was being examined. I forced myself to move forward, my legs stiff with tension. I couldn't let myself freeze, couldn't get into the panic creeping up my spine. But every step I took, the feeling grew stronger. It wasn't in my head. There was something there, something unseen, something alive in the darkness. I reached the end of the street, where the narrow alley opened into a larger courtyard. The buildings here were old, weathered by time, their stone facades chipped and cracked. An iron gate stood in front of me, partially ajar, leading into a small garden overrun with weeds. There was no one in sight, yet I felt the pressure of eyes on me, the weight of an unseen gaze pressing against my chest. The whisper came again, clear this time, close, almost like a breath against my ear. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. But again, nothing. Only the dead silence of the night. A cold, twisted thought crept into my mind. What if the presence wasn't just watching me? What if it had been with me all along, moving in the shadows, slipping into the spaces where I couldn't see? The hair on the back of my neck prickled. It felt as if the entire world had fallen silent, as though the very air held its breath. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. That's when I saw it. From the corner of the courtyard, in the farthest shadow, I saw a figure. Not like the one I'd seen in the library. This one was solid, its outline darker than the surrounding darkness, but somehow wrong. Like a distortion of the world around it. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching. Its form was human, but its features were hidden by the cloak of shadows, and its eyes. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them, deep within me, as though they were boring straight through to my soul. I couldn't breathe. My body went rigid, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, frozen by the sheer weight of that gaze, the unblinking stare of something ancient, something far older than anything I could comprehend. And then, in the distance, I heard it again, the whisper, but this time it wasn't just one voice. It was many. A chorus of whispers, all blending together, each one more desperate than the last. Each one beckoning me closer, urging me to approach the figure, to step into the darkness. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I turned and ran. I didn't care about anything but getting away from that thing, from the weight of its eyes, the pull of its presence. My legs burned as I ran, my feet slamming against the cobblestones, but the whisper followed, growing louder until it felt like the very ground beneath me was trembling with the force of it. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. But I knew that it was still there, in the shadows, waiting for the moment when I would no longer be able to escape. I didn't stop running until the familiar streetlights of my neighborhood came into view. The soft glow of their light offered no comfort, only a reminder of how far I had strayed from what I knew to be safe. My breath was ragged, my chest heating with each panicked inhale. My heart still pounded in my ears, but the weight of those whispers, that crushing presence, had not eased. If anything, it had only intensified the further I ran. I stumbled into my apartment building, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my keys. The door finally creaked open, and I rushed inside, slamming it shut behind me. My body leaned against the door, the solid wood offering no reassurance. The silence inside was deafening. It felt wrong. There was no way to explain it, but I could feel it again, the watchful presence lingering just beyond the threshold. I locked the door, bolting every lock, even though I knew deep down it wouldn't stop whatever was out there. It didn't matter how many locks I put in place, or how many doors I closed, nothing could stop what was hunting me. I sank to the floor, pressing my back against the cold wall. My hands were still trembling, my mind racing with fragments of thought. What had I seen? What had been watching me? That thing, in the shadows, it wasn't human. I couldn't convince myself that it was. The way it moved, the way it felt, it was something else entirely. The apartment was small, the dim glow of the lamps flickering as if struggling to stay alive. The walls seemed to close in around me, the corners of the room darker than they should have been. I couldn't focus. I couldn't think. My eyes darted from one corner to another, as though expecting something to emerge from the darkness. The stillness of the room pressed in on me, suffocating me with its silence. It wasn't right. I knew that it wasn't right. I staggered to my feet, my mind desperate to find a distraction, anything to pull me from the suffocating anxiety that was creeping up my spine. My gaze landed on the bookshelf across from me, cluttered with books that I had long since stopped reading. One book, in particular, caught my attention. The cover was faded, the title barely visible, but I knew it, The Watcher's Mark. I had bought it years ago, on a whim, never actually reading it. Something about the book felt significant, though. Something pulled me toward it. I approached the shelf, my hand trembling as I reached for it. I ran my fingers over the spine, as though the book might hold the answers I was looking for. When I pulled it free from the shelf, I couldn't help but notice that it felt unnaturally heavy, like it had absorbed something over the years, some dark weight that had seeped into it. I flipped it open. The pages were yellowed with age, brittle to the touch. The first chapter was titled The Watcher's Gaze. I frowned. The title mirrored my own experience. A sickly feeling crept into my stomach. I turned the pages, eyes scanning the text. The words were disjointed at first, cryptic in their meaning, but as I read, the terror from earlier started to surge back, threatening to swallow me whole. The book described the Guardian, a dark entity that lurked in the shadows, feeding off the fear of those it stalked. It was said to have no true form, only the power to mimic what it wanted, to become whatever it needed to be to terrify its prey. The Guardian's presence was never directly seen, but always felt. And the most chilling detail, once it locked onto its target, it would never leave. Not until it claimed them. I dropped the book in shock, my hands now slick with sweat. The whispers from earlier returned, faint but unmistakable. They were not just in my head. The words of the book, they weren't just a story. It was real. I scrambled backward, my back hitting the wall again. I could feel it, that sense of being watched, closing in on me. It was here, inside the apartment. I wasn't alone. The temperature dropped sharply, the room growing cold as though a gust of wind had blown in. My breath came on invisible clouds, and I could see my own panic reflected in the condensation forming on the window. I looked around frantically, searching for any sign, any movement. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive stillness. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. I had to get out, get away. I rushed to the door, only to stop dead in my tracks when I saw it. The hallway outside was completely dark, but at the end, near the stairs, there was a figure. Tall and cloaked in shadow, its outline indistinct but unmistakably there. It didn't move, but its presence was so tangible, I could feel the pressure of its gaze from here. It was waiting for me to make a move, waiting for me to make the first mistake. I couldn't breathe. My entire body felt like it was being crushed under the weight of that stare. The figure didn't shift, didn't make a sound. But I knew it was still there, even though I couldn't fully see it. It was right on the other side of the door, watching, waiting. Suddenly, a sharp crack sounded from the corner of the room. I whipped my head toward the sound. The bookshelf, the book, was now lying on the floor as though it had been knocked from its resting place. A deep chill crept through the air, colder than anything I'd felt before. The whispers grew louder, but they weren't the same as before. They were clearer now, closer, more frantic. There was a sense of urgency in them, as though the presence was growing impatient. I backed away from the door, heart racing. The darkness in the hallway seemed to stretch toward me, the figure becoming more distinct, more real. I could feel its malice, its hunger, and I knew it wasn't going to stop until it had me. The door rattled. Then, silence. And with that silence, the presence rushed forward. The door rattled again. This time, I didn't flinch. I couldn't. My body had frozen, the air thick with the chill that seemed to pour in from every corner of the room. The faint whispering intensified, closer now, like a soft hiss right behind my ear, but when I spun around, there was no one. No one I could see, at least. The presence was real. I could feel it in the marrow of my bones. It pressed against me, not physically, but in the way that fear takes hold of your mind, your body, and drags you to the edge. My heart pounded harder, faster. My hands were slick with cold sweat, and for the first time, I realized just how much I was trembling. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It felt like something was crawling inside my chest, squeezing every ounce of air out of me. The whispers stopped. Just like that. Silent. For a moment, the air grew heavier, as if the weight of the silence itself was too much to bear. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to look at the dark hallway where I knew the shadow waited. But I had no choice. My body moved against my will. Slowly, I turned my head, my eyes unwillingly drawn to the door. The hallway outside was still empty, but now I could see something I hadn't before, a faint outline, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. A dark shape in the shape of a person. Standing there, unmoving, watching. It was waiting. I wanted to scream, but my voice was trapped in my throat. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like stone. The darkness in the hallway stretched impossibly long, as if the space itself was bending to allow the figure to linger just out of reach. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, the shadows folding over themselves until they seemed to take shape. I heard a soft scraping sound. It came from the floor, just behind me. I whipped around to see the book I had dropped earlier, the Watcher's Mark, sliding across the floor toward me. It moved as if being pushed by some invisible hand, scraping against the wooden boards with a noise that reverberated through my skull. I didn't want to touch it. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get away from that book, that presence, whatever it was. But I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The whispers, soft but urgent, returned, now a chorus of voices layered together, overlapping and indistinct, but unmistakably there. The book stopped in front of me. I had no choice. I crouched down, my fingers trembling as they reached for it. The moment my hand touched the cover, a shock of cold shot through me. My fingers burned, icy and sharp, as though the book itself had absorbed all the chill from the room and transferred it straight into my bones. I wanted to pull away, but something else, a pull, a force, kept my fingers clamped to the book. "Don't open it." The voice came in my mind, faint but clear. It was my own voice, but not. It echoed with a warning, a desperation I could feel deep in my chest. But my fingers, they were already flipping the pages. It was as though I had no control, as if something else was guiding my movements. Each page seemed to fall open of its own accord, the yellow paper crinkling under my touch. The words on the pages seemed to blur and shift as my eyes scanned them. The book was talking, whispering to me, describing things I couldn't possibly understand. But it didn't matter. It felt like it was pulling me in, like the presence in the hallway was connected to the book itself. I had to read. I had to understand. The guardian is patient. The words leapt off the page. I felt them penetrate my mind like cold needles. The guardian waits until the victim is fragile, until they are lost in the dark, and then it shows itself. I looked up from the book, unable to stop myself. The figure in the hallway was closer now. It had moved without sound, without warning. It had been standing just at the threshold of my vision, and now it was closer, a mere footstep away. I could feel its presence like a weight pressing on my chest. And then it moved. Not in a way that made sense, but in a way that I could never have imagined. The figure shifted unnaturally, its form rippling as though it was both part of the shadows and not. Its face was almost human, but there was something wrong, something that made my stomach twist. The features were blurred, shifting with every second, but the eyes were the worst part. They were hollow, black as the void, and they locked onto mine, unblinking, unyielding. A cold, oppressive force poured into my chest as if those eyes were reaching straight into my soul, tearing away pieces of me I didn't even know existed. I tried to scream, but the air had vanished from my lungs. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. The weight of its gaze was too much. It felt like the world around me was collapsing, like the walls were closing in. But just as suddenly as it had moved, the figure froze. It was still, silent, watching. "You are already marked," the voice whispered, but it wasn't in my head anymore. It was in the room, low and guttural, an unnatural voice that rasped like something ancient and decayed. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The fear had consumed me, and I was paralyzed, trapped in my own mind as the shadow moved closer. But then, as I felt my consciousness slipping away into the crushing darkness, I remembered something. The book. It held the answers. The words on the pages weren't just a warning. They were a guide. I reached for it again. The moment my fingers brushed the pages again, a rush of icy cold shot up my arm. My skin prickled, and I could feel the shadows creeping up my neck, like 100 unseen hands pulling at me, dragging me further into the darkness. The air around me had thickened, heavy, suffocating. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls were closing in, pressing on me from all sides. The figure in the hallway remained still, its black eyes locked on mine, but its presence was now suffocating, palpable. It wasn't just watching, it was waiting. I flipped the book open frantically, my breath shallow, my heart racing as I searched for something, anything, that could save me. But the pages seemed to mock me, slipping past my fingers faster than I could read, each word a riddle I couldn't solve. The whispers, once faint, were now a constant hum in my ears, their voices mingling into one low, guttural sound that vibrated through my skull. "You are already marked." The words repeated in my mind, over and over again, like a mantra, a curse. The guardian had chosen me. There was no escaping it now. I had crossed some invisible line, a point of no return. I could feel the pressure building in the room, the sense of being trapped tightening around me. I was suffocating. The book, the key to it all, was slipping through my trembling fingers as if the pages themselves were determined to pull me into the very darkness I feared. But then I saw it. A single sentence near the back of the book, written in what appeared to be an ancient script, the letters twisting and warping in the dim light. I couldn't read it. Not fully. But I didn't need to. The meaning was clear enough. It waits for the moment when fear is strongest. The guardian fed on fear. My fear. The realization struck me like a hammer to the chest. The more I struggled, the more I fought to break free from its grasp, the stronger it would become. But I wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. There had to be something more in the book. I just had to find it. I turned the pages frantically, my fingers slick with sweat, heart pounding in my throat. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, as if the voices themselves were urging me to stop, to let go. But I pushed on, searching through the cryptic writings, the drawings that seemed to shift and move while I wasn't looking directly at them. And then, I found it. A single word, scrawled in the margin of the page. A word that stood out from the rest. Reversal. The word burned in my mind. Reversal. The guardian's grip could be undone. It could be turned back. The question was how? The figure in the hallway shifted, and I felt a cold hand wrap around my heart. My body screamed for me to look away, to close my eyes, to run. But I couldn't. I had to keep my focus on the book. I had to understand how to fight back. The shadows around me deepened, swirling into shapes that seemed to mock my every attempt at escape. The air felt thicker now, as if the very essence of the room had become corrupted, twisted by the guardian's presence. I gripped the book tighter, flipping through the pages, searching for anything that might explain what the word reversal meant. My mind raced, but it was hard to focus. The whispers had turned into a cacophony of voices, all shouting at me, all demanding my attention. Turn back. The voice in my head was my own, but distorted, twisted by fear. I could feel my pulse in my ears, a steady drumbeat that threatened to drown out everything else. The figure in the hallway took a slow step forward, its form becoming more defined, more real with each passing second. I couldn't let it get closer. I had to act now. I scanned the final pages one last time, the frantic energy in my movements matching the panic rising in my chest. And there it was, right at the end of the page, just before the last few words faded into the blank space. To undo the guardian, you must face it. You must become the darkness. The words sent a chill down my spine. Become the darkness? How could that be possible? The thought was absurd, terrifying. But there was no time to question it. The guardian was here, and it was coming for me. I didn't think. I acted. Without fully understanding what I was doing, I slammed the book shut, holding it tight against my chest. The cold burned through the cover, a shock that rattled me to my core. The room shook. The shadows in the hallway seemed to shudder and twist, as if the book's power was fighting back. And then, the figure, the guardian, lunged forward, but its movements were slower now, more hesitant, as if the very darkness it drew from was being pulled back from it. I felt the air shift. I felt the fear that had once gripped me begin to recede, pushed away by some unseen force. The book, somehow, was doing it. I was doing it. I opened my eyes. The hallway was empty. The guardian was gone. But the silence left behind was deafening. The shadows, though weaker, still clung to the edges of the room, lingering in the corners like a half-forgotten nightmare. My heart was still racing, but I couldn't move. I didn't know if I was safe or if I had just made things worse. The book had done something, but at what cost? I dropped it to the floor, my hands still trembling as the cold sensation of its touch lingered on my skin. And in that moment, I knew it wasn't over. The guardian wasn't gone. It had only just begun. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.